The crimson sun hung low over Baxter Creek, Texas, as Margaret Rose stumbled through the center of town, her face streaked with tears and blood from a split lip. It was 1879, and the West was as cruel as it was beautiful to those who didn't have protection. Margaret clutched her tattered shawl around her shoulders, every step sending fresh waves of pain through her bruised ribs as the crowd of onlookers grew behind her. "Thief!" bellowed Edgar Walton, the town's general store owner, a man whose wealth was matched only by his cruelty. His face was flushed with rage as he pursued her down the muddy Main Street. "Stop that woman! She's stolen from me!" Margaret hadn't stolen anything. She'd simply questioned the exorbitant price he'd charged for a sack of flour when she noticed he'd marked it up double for her compared to the man ahead in line. But Walton didn't tolerate being questioned, especially not by a woman who'd arrived in town just 3 weeks prior with nothing but a small trunk of possessions and secrets she kept close. "Please," she begged, turning to face the growing crowd. "I didn't take anything, I swear it." Her plea fell on deaf ears as Walton caught up to her, grabbing her arm with such force that Margaret cried out. He spun her around to face the gathering townspeople, his fingers digging into her flesh. "This is what happens to thieves in Baxter Creek," Walton announced, his voice carrying across the street where businesses had emptied as people gathered to witness the spectacle. The first blow caught Margaret across the face, snapping her head back with such force that she nearly lost her footing. Stars exploded behind her eyes as she tasted fresh blood. The second blow struck her midsection, driving the air from her lungs and sending her to her knees in the mud. "Stop." She gasped, raising her hands to shield herself from the next blow. "Please." But Walton was not finished. He grabbed her by her long chestnut hair, yanking her head back as he addressed the crowd. "Let this be a lesson to any of you thinking of cheating Edgar Walton." Margaret could barely see through her tears and the blood trickling into her eye from a cut on her forehead. The faces of the onlookers blurred together. Some looked away in shame, others watched with morbid fascination, but none stepped forward to help. This was the frontier justice of the West, harsh, unforgiving, and often misguided. She closed her eyes, bracing for the next blow when the sound of heavy boots approached rapidly. The crowd parted, and Margaret felt Walton's grip on her hair release suddenly. "That's enough." The voice was deep, steady as bedrock, and carried an authority that made the very air still. Margaret forced her eyes open to see a tall figure standing between her and Walton. He wore dusty trail clothes and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, shadowing his features, but she could see the hard line of his jaw, set with determination. His shoulders were broad beneath a worn leather duster coat, and one hand rested casually on the revolver at his hip. "This ain't your business, Ferguson," Walton spat, though he took a step back. "You beating a woman half to death in the middle of town, I'm making it my business." The man Ferguson didn't raise his voice, but something in his tone made Walton's face pale. "She's a thief," Walton insisted, though with less conviction. "Then you bring her to the sheriff. That's how the law works." Ferguson turned slightly, allowing Margaret to see more of his profile: a straight nose, weathered skin, and eyes the color of a summer storm. "Unless you've appointed yourself judge and executioner while I was away," a murmur rippled through the crowd. Margaret realized she was still kneeling in the mud, her entire body trembling from pain and fear. "She questioned my prices," Walton finally admitted, his earlier accusation of theft forgotten. "No woman talks to me that way." Ferguson gave a soft, dangerous chuckle that contained no humor. "So she hurt your pride and you decided to hurt her body." He glanced around at the townspeople. "And all of you just stood here and watched." Without another word to Walton or the shame-faced crowd, Ferguson turned fully toward Margaret. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with dark hair visible beneath his hat and several days' worth of stubble on his jaw. Deep lines around his eyes spoke of a man who'd seen more than his fair share of hardship. "Madam," he said softly, crouching down beside her, his voice gentle now. "Can you stand?" Margaret tried to nod, but the movement sent a fresh wave of pain through her head. "I think so," she whispered. Ferguson's eyes narrowed as he took in her injuries, the swelling already beginning around her eye, the cut on her lip, the way she cradled her ribs. Without hesitation, he shrugged out of his duster coat and wrapped it gently around her shoulders. "Here," he said, his voice for her ears alone. "You're shaking." The coat was warm from his body and smelled of leather, tobacco, and the open prairie. It enveloped her completely, and for the first time since the ordeal began, Margaret felt a small measure of safety. With surprising tenderness, he helped her to her feet, keeping a steadying hand at her elbow when she swayed. She was acutely aware of how the entire town watched them, the silence almost deafening. "My name's Henry Ferguson," he told her, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I'll see you safely wherever you need to go." "Margaret Rose," she replied, her voice barely audible through her swollen lip. Henry nodded once, then turned back to face Walton and the crowd. "If anyone has a problem with me escorting Miss Rose to safety, now's the time to speak up." Not a single person made a sound. Even Walton had backed away, his moment of bravado gone in the face of Henry's calm authority. "I thought not," Henry said, and with a gentle pressure on her elbow, he guided Margaret away from the scene of her humiliation. They walked slowly down the main street, past the saloon and the blacksmith shop, toward the small boarding house where Margaret had taken a room upon her arrival in Baxter Creek. Every step was agony, but she forced herself to keep moving, aware of the curious eyes following their progress. "Thank you," she managed when they were far enough away from the crowd. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Henry's jaw tightened. "Nothing good," he said grimly. "Walton's had this town under his thumb for too long. Folk around here have forgotten what it means to stand up for what's right." "You know him well?" Margaret asked, partly to distract herself from the pain and partly out of genuine curiosity about this man who'd stepped forward when no one else would. "Well enough to keep my distance," Henry replied. "I've been away driving cattle north to the railroads, just got back yesterday." His eyes slid to her face, taking in her injuries again. "Bad timing for you, if I'd been here sooner." "You can't blame yourself for another man's cruelty," Margaret said softly. They reached the boarding house, and Henry helped her up the steps to the porch. The elderly woman who ran the establishment, Mrs. Weber, opened the door before they could knock, her face pale with concern. "My heavens, child, I heard what happened. Come in," she fussed, ushering them inside. She gave Henry a curious look but didn't question his presence. "I've got some witch hazel and clean cloths. We need to tend those cuts." "Thank you, Mrs. Weber," Margaret said, wincing as she spoke. "Mr. Ferguson came to my aid." The older woman nodded approvingly at Henry. "About time someone in this town showed some backbone. Come on through to the kitchen." Henry hesitated at the threshold, removing his hat. "If you're in good hands, Miss Rose, I should take my leave." Something like panic fluttered in Margaret's chest at the thought of him leaving. "Please," she said, surprising herself with the desperation in her voice. "Stay just for a little while. I don't feel safe yet." His eyes softened and he nodded once. "Of course, in Mrs. Weber's kitchen," the elderly woman tutted and fussed as she cleaned Margaret's wounds. Henry stood by the door, hat in hand, his presence somehow filling the small room. Margaret was still wrapped in his coat, unable to bring herself to remove it despite the warmth of the kitchen. "Walton's always been a mean one," Mrs. Weber said as she dabbed witch hazel on Margaret's split lip. "But he's never gone this far before. Must be something about you that got under his skin, dear." Margaret met Henry's eyes briefly over the older woman's shoulder. "I simply questioned why he charged me more for flour than the man ahead of me." Henry's expression darkened. "He's been doing that to newcomers for years, charging them more until they learn not to question it." "Well, I've never been good at staying silent when something isn't right," Margaret said, then winced as Mrs. Weber pressed a cold cloth to her swelling eye. "That'll be a nasty bruise come morning," the landlady said, "but I don't think anything's broken, thank the Lord." When Mrs. Weber had finished tending to her visible injuries, she insisted Margaret drink a cup of willow bark tea for the pain. "I'll leave you two to talk," she said with a knowing glance between them. "Just keep the door open, mind. I run a respectable house." After she left, Henry finally moved from his post by the door and took a seat across from Margaret at the kitchen table. In the lamplight, she could see him clearly for the first time, the strong lines of his face, the small scar that bisected his left eyebrow, the way his dark hair curled slightly where it was too long at his collar. "You're new to Baxter Creek," he said. It wasn't a question. Margaret nodded. "3 weeks ago, I came west for a fresh start." "Most people do," Henry replied, his voice neutral, "but Baxter Creek's not the easiest place to make one. Town's got problems. I'm beginning to see that." Margaret attempted a smile, though it hurt her split lip. "Are you from around here, Mr. Ferguson?" "Henry, please." He ran a hand through his hair, pushing it back from his forehead. "I have a small ranch about 10 miles south, came here 5 years ago from Missouri." He studied her face. "Where are you from, Miss Rose?" "Margaret," she corrected. "And I'm from Boston, originally." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Boston to Baxter Creek is quite a journey for a woman alone." "Sometimes you don't have much choice in the matter," Margaret said softly, looking down at her hands, which still trembled slightly. Henry seemed to understand she didn't want to elaborate. "What will you do now? After today, Walton will make things difficult for you here." The reality of her situation hit Margaret suddenly. She had very little money, no family to return to, and now she'd made an enemy of the most powerful man in town. "I don't know," she admitted. "I can't go back east. Do you have any skills, something you could do to earn a living?" "I was a school teacher in Boston," Margaret said. "I had hoped to find similar work here, but Baxter Creek already has a school teacher," Henry finished for her. "Mrs. Hollister. She's been teaching the children here for 20 years. Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of her circumstances pressing down on her. "I've been taking in mending to make ends meet, but it's barely enough for room and board." Henry was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on the table. "My ranch," he finally said. "The double F, it's not much, but it's growing. I could use help." Margaret blinked in surprise. "Help? What kind of help?" "I've been living rough bachelor style. The house needs a woman's touch." He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm not proposing anything improper, Miss Rose. I have a cabin separate from the main house where you could stay. You'd have privacy and safety, and I'd pay you fair wages for keeping house, cooking meals." Margaret stared at him, unsure if she'd heard correctly. "You're offering me a position as your housekeeper." "It wouldn't be easy work," Henry warned. "Ranch life never is." "But you'd be away from Walton and his influence, and—" He hesitated. "I'd make sure no one ever laid a hand on you again." The sincerity in his voice made Margaret's throat tight with emotion. Here was a man she'd just met, offering her sanctuary when she needed it most. It seemed too good to be true, and in her experience, such things usually were. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" she asked, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. Henry's storm-gray eyes met her steadily. "Because 20 years ago, my mother was in a similar situation. No one helped her." His jaw tightened. "I swore I'd never stand by and let that happen if I could prevent it." Margaret searched his face for any sign of deception, but found only earnest determination. Still, the idea of going to a remote ranch with a man she barely knew. "I understand your hesitation," Henry said, reading her thoughts. "Mrs. Weber knows me. Ask her about my character. Take the night to think about it." He stood, reaching for his hat. "I'll return tomorrow for your answer." Margaret realized she was still wearing his coat and began to shrug it off. "Your coat, keep it for now," Henry said. "You can return it tomorrow." He moved to the door, then paused, looking back at her. "Whatever you decide, Margaret, don't stay in town if it's not safe for you. There are other places, other opportunities." After he left, Margaret sat alone in the kitchen, his coat still wrapped around her shoulders like armor. The willow bark tea had dulled her pain somewhat, but her mind was racing with too many thoughts to find any real comfort. Mrs. Weber returned to the kitchen, bustling around as she prepared her evening meal. "That Henry Ferguson," she said conversationally, "he's a good man, keeps to himself mostly, works harder than any 3 men I know, never heard a soul speak ill of him." Margaret looked up. "Did he tell you what he offered?" "No, but I can guess." The elderly woman sat across from her. "A position at his ranch." When Margaret nodded, Mrs. Weber continued, "You could do worse, dear, much worse. The double F is becoming one of the more prosperous spreads around here, and Henry." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He's not like most men, he respects women. Learned it from his mother, I expect, remarkable woman from what I hear. You don't think it would be improper, me going to live at a bachelor's ranch, Mrs. Weber chuckled. Child, this is the frontier. Propriety takes different forms out here. Besides, Henry mentioned a separate cabin, didn't he? At Margaret's surprised look, the landlady smiled. I know him well enough to know he'd make such arrangements. He'd never put your reputation at risk. Margaret considered this. What about Walton? Won't he make trouble? Edgar Walton's reach doesn't extend much beyond town limits, Mrs. Weber said firmly. And Henry Ferguson isn't a man anyone picks a fight with lightly. That night, as Margaret lay in her bed, every movement a reminder of the day's violence, she found herself thinking about Henry Ferguson. The gentle way he'd wrapped his coat around her, the quiet strength in his voice when he'd stood up to Walton, the sincerity in his eyes when he'd made his offer. Boston seemed a lifetime away, along with all the reasons she'd fled west. She'd hoped to rebuild her life in Baxter Creek, but Walton had made that impossible today. Perhaps this was the next step in her journey, a ranch 10 miles from town, with a man who'd shown her more kindness in an hour than she'd experienced in months. By morning, her decision was made. Henry returned mid-morning, looking more put together than he had the day before. He'd shaved, and his dark hair was neatly combed beneath his hat. He wore a clean shirt under a wool vest, though his boots and denim still carried the dust of ranch work. Margaret met him on the porch of the boarding house, his coat folded over her arm. The bruises on her face had darkened overnight, making her normally fair complexion a canvas of purple and yellow. Her lip was still swollen, but the cut had begun to heal. Miss Rose, Henry greeted her, removing his hat. His eyes moved over her injuries, and a muscle in his jaw twitched. How are you feeling today? Better than I look, I suspect, Margaret replied with a small smile. Please sit with me. They sat side by side on the porch swing, a respectable distance between them. For a moment neither spoke, watching as a wagon rolled past on the street, the driver tipping his hat to them. I've been thinking about your offer, Margaret finally said, handing him back his coat. Thank you for the loan of this. Henry accepted the coat with a nod. And have you reached a decision? Margaret took a deep breath. I have questions first, if you don't mind. Ask anything you wish. This position, what exactly would my duties entail? Henry seemed prepared for this question. Cooking meals for myself and my 2 ranch hands, keeping the main house in order, perhaps tending a kitchen garden if you've the inclination. The ranch work itself would be our concern, not yours. And the living arrangements. There's a small cabin about 50 yards from the main house. It was built for a foreman, but I've never hired one. It has a bedroom, a sitting area, and its own stove. Basic but comfortable, he paused. You'd have your privacy there and a door that locks from the inside. Margaret appreciated his understanding of her concerns. The wages. $30 a month plus room and board, Henry said without hesitation. More if you're willing to teach my ranch hands their letters. Tomas is Mexican and wants to learn English better. Samuel can barely write his name. It was a fair wage for the work described, more than fair, actually. Margaret suspected Henry knew exactly how generous his offer was. One last question, she said. Why me? You could hire any woman looking for work. Why offer this to someone you just met? Henry was quiet for a moment, looking out at the town. I told you about my mother, he finally said. What I didn't tell you is that she died from the beatings my father gave her. I was 12 years old. He turned to look at Margaret, his eyes haunted by old pain. When I saw Walton hitting you yesterday, I saw my mother all over again. The difference is, this time I could do something about it. Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion. I'm sorry about your mother. Henry nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy without inviting more. So, Miss Rose, have I answered your questions satisfactorily? Yes, Margaret said, and I accept your offer, Mr. Ferguson. Relief washed over his features, quickly masked by a businesslike nod. Good. I've brought the wagon. We can collect your belongings and be at the ranch by midday if that suits you. An hour later, with her trunk loaded in the back of Henry's wagon and goodbyes said to Mrs. Weber, Margaret found herself leaving Baxter Creek behind. She sat beside Henry on the wagon seat, a parasol shielding her fair skin and injured face from the Texas sun. As they passed the general store, Margaret saw Walton watching from the doorway, his expression dark with malice. She unconsciously moved closer to Henry, who noticed her discomfort. "He won't trouble you again," Henry said quietly, his eyes meeting Walton's in a silent challenge that made the store owner turn away first. The road south from town wound through scrubby rangeland dotted with mesquite trees and prickly pear cactus. In the distance, low hills rose against the brilliant blue sky. After the suffocating tension of town, the open country felt like freedom to Margaret. "It's beautiful," she said, taking in the wild landscape. "Different from anything I knew in the East, but beautiful in its own way." Henry glanced at her, something like approval in his expression. "Most Easterners see only the harshness at first, takes time to recognize the beauty beneath." "I think that's true of most worthwhile things," Margaret replied. They fell into a comfortable silence as the wagon rolled on. Eventually, Henry pointed to a distant rise. "My land begins there. The double F runs from that ridge all the way to the creek you see in the distance, and south for about 3 miles. As they crested the ridge, the ranch came into view below. A modest but well-built house of stone and timber stood at the center of the property, with a large barn and several corrals nearby. A bunkhouse sat a short distance from the main house, and beyond that, Margaret could see the small cabin Henry had mentioned. Fields of grass stretched in all directions, dotted with cattle, not a massive herd but respectable in size. "It's not much compared to some of the big outfits," Henry said, a note of pride nonetheless evident in his voice. "But it's mine, free and clear. Started with 20 head of cattle and built it up to nearly 300 now." "It's impressive," Margaret said sincerely, "especially for a man working alone. Not entirely alone. Tomas and Samuel are good men, been with me for 3 years now." As they approached the house, Margaret saw 2 men emerge from the barn. One was clearly of Mexican descent, with dark features and a wide smile. The other was a tall black man with powerful shoulders and a dignified bearing. Both looked curiously at Margaret as Henry drew the wagon to a halt. "Miss Rose, this is Tomas Vasquez and Samuel Washington, the best ranch hands in Texas," Henry said, jumping down from the wagon seat. "Boys, this is Miss Margaret Rose. She's going to be keeping house for us." "Señorita," Tomas said with a respectful nod. "Welcome to Double F." Samuel tipped his hat. "Madam, it's a pleasure." Margaret was struck by the easy camaraderie between Henry and his men. There was none of the rigid hierarchy she'd observed on other ranches during her journey west. These men worked together as equals, or very nearly so. Henry helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and sure at her waist. Margaret was aware of how his touch lingered for just a moment longer than necessary, and how her heart quickened in response. "Tomas, Samuel, would you mind unloading Miss Rose's trunk and taking it to the cabin?" Henry asked. "I'll show her around the property." As the men moved to comply, Henry offered Margaret his arm. "Shall we?" The tour began with the main house, a surprisingly comfortable dwelling with a large kitchen, a dining room, a study lined with books that made Margaret's heart leap with pleasure, and 2 bedrooms upstairs. Everything was clean but Spartan, clearly maintained by a man with little time or inclination for decorative touches. "This would be your domain," Henry said as they stood in the kitchen. "I've been doing the cooking, but I won't pretend it's anything special. The men and I would be grateful for a woman's skill." "I'm a decent cook," Margaret assured him. "Nothing fancy, but I can manage hearty meals." From the main house, they walked to the barn, where Henry showed her the horses, 6 in all, including his own mount, a magnificent black stallion named Thunder. The corrals beyond held cattle being readied for market, and in the distance, the main herd grazed peacefully. Finally, they approached the cabin that would be Margaret's home. It was smaller than the main house but solidly built, with a covered porch and 2 windows with real glass. Inside, Margaret found it basic but clean, with a bedroom containing a bed frame and mattress, a sitting area with a small stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a washstand. Her trunk had been placed at the foot of the bed. "It's not much," Henry said, watching her face carefully. "But we could fix it up. Get curtains, maybe a rocking chair for the porch. It's perfect, Margaret said and meant it. After weeks in a tiny room at the boarding house and months before that of uncertainty and fear, the little cabin represented something she hadn't dared hope for: security. Henry looked relieved. I'll leave you to settle in. Supper's usually at sundown in the main house. Today, though, you're our guest. I'll do the cooking. After he left, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, taking in her new surroundings. Through the open door, she could see the main ranch house, the barn, and beyond them, the vast Texas landscape stretching to the horizon. For the first time since leaving Boston, she felt like she could breathe freely. The pain of her injuries reminded her of how quickly fortunes could change for worse, yes, but sometimes for better too. Yesterday, she'd been beaten in the street, humiliated and afraid. Today, she had a home, employment, and the protection of a man who seemed determined to ensure her safety. It wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself when she left Boston, but as Margaret began unpacking her few possessions, she allowed herself to feel something she'd almost forgotten: hope. Supper that evening was a surprisingly pleasant affair. Henry had prepared a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and salt pork, served at the large table in the main house's dining room. Tomas and Samuel joined them, and Margaret was struck again by the lack of formality between employer and employees. The conversation flowed easily, with Henry and his men telling stories of ranch life that had Margaret alternately laughing and gasping in surprise. No one mentioned her bruised face or asked about the incident in town, for which she was grateful. Miss Rose was a schoolteacher in Boston, Henry mentioned as they finished their meal. I've told her how you want to improve your reading and writing, Tomas, and Samuel your figures. Tomas's face lit up. Truly, señorita, you would teach us. I'd be happy to, Margaret said, warmed by his enthusiasm. We could set aside time a few evenings each week. That would be a blessing, madam, Samuel said. I can read some, but writing gives me trouble. As the evening wore on, Margaret found herself increasingly comfortable in this unexpected company. The men treated her with respect, but without the stifling formality she'd known in Boston society or the thinly veiled contempt she'd encountered from some in Baxter Creek. When it was time to retire for the night, Henry walked her back to her cabin, a lantern lighting their way in the gathering darkness. Thank you for today, Margaret said as they reached her door. For everything? Henry nodded, his face half shadowed in the lantern light. I hope you'll be happy here, Margaret. It was the first time he'd used her given name without the miss preceding it, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent an unexpected warmth through her. I think I will be, she replied softly. Good night, Henry. Good night. He handed her the lantern and waited until she was safely inside with the door closed before walking back to the main house. Margaret moved to the window and watched his retreating figure, silhouetted against the starlit sky. For a moment, she allowed herself to acknowledge what she'd been trying to ignore all day, that beyond his kindness and the sanctuary he offered, there was something about Henry Ferguson that stirred feelings she'd thought she'd never experience again. Pushing the thought aside, she prepared for bed, wincing as her bruised body protested each movement. As she drifted toward sleep, the events of the past 2 days swirled in her mind: the terror and pain in Baxter Creek, followed by the unexpected rescue and this new beginning at the Double F Ranch. Margaret fell asleep thinking of storm-gray eyes and the gentle way Henry Ferguson had wrapped his coat around her battered body. The days that followed established a rhythm to life at the Double F. Margaret rose early each morning to prepare breakfast for Henry and his men before they headed out for the day's work. She spent her days cleaning the main house, doing laundry, baking bread, and tending to the small kitchen garden that had been neglected in recent months. Her body healed gradually, the bruises fading from angry purple to yellowing patches that would soon disappear entirely. With each passing day, she felt stronger, more settled in her new role. 3 evenings a week, after supper, she held informal lessons for Tomas and Samuel at the dining room table. Tomas was eager to improve his English writing, while Samuel had a natural aptitude for mathematics once given proper instruction. Henry often joined them, not as a student but as an observer, sometimes reading a book from his surprisingly extensive library while Margaret taught. It was during these quiet evenings that Margaret began to truly know the three men she now lived among. Tomas had come north from Mexico 5 years earlier, sending most of his wages back to his widowed mother and sisters. Samuel had been born into slavery in Louisiana, gained his freedom during the war, and worked his way west in search of a place where his skills would matter more than the color of his skin. And Henry, though more reserved about his past, gradually revealed pieces of himself through casual comments and the books he chose to read. She learned he'd been largely self-educated after his mother's death, that he'd worked cattle drives and as a ranch hand for years before saving enough to buy his own land, that he had an unexpected fondness for poetry and history. 2 weeks after Margaret's arrival at the Double F, Henry found her in the kitchen garden, harvesting tomatoes for that evening's supper. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly, but Margaret had adapted to the heat, wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat and keeping a jug of water nearby. "Those are coming in nicely," Henry said, leaning against the garden fence. "Garden's looking better than it ever has." Margaret looked up, shading her eyes to see him better. "It just needed a little attention. The soil here is surprisingly good." "I'm heading into town for supplies," Henry said. "Thought you might want to come along, get anything you need." Margaret felt her stomach tighten at the thought of returning to Baxter Creek, of possibly encountering Walton again. Henry seemed to read her hesitation. "You don't have to," he added quickly. "Just thought you might like a change of scenery." "No, I'll come," Margaret decided, straightening her spine. "I can't avoid town forever, and we need some things for the kitchen that I forgot to put on your list." Henry nodded, his expression approving. "I'll hitch up the wagon." An hour later, they were on the road to town, the wagon loaded with wool from the small flock of sheep Henry kept on the north section of his property. Margaret sat beside him on the wagon seat, wearing her best dress and the straw hat to shield her face, which was almost healed but still showed faint yellowish bruises. "We'll sell the wool, get our supplies, and be on our way," Henry said as they approached town. "No need to linger." Margaret appreciated his understanding without needing to voice her concerns. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd come to recognize that as one of Henry's qualities, a perceptiveness that allowed him to anticipate others' needs without making them feel weak for having them. Baxter Creek looked unchanged as they rolled down the main street. It was market day, and the town was busier than usual, with farmers and ranchers from the surrounding area coming to sell their goods and purchase supplies. Henry pulled the wagon up in front of the dry goods store, notably not Walton's establishment, and helped Margaret down. "I'll handle the wool first, then meet you here in about an hour," he said. "Will that give you enough time?" "Plenty," Margaret assured him, grateful that he wasn't being overly protective. Inside the dry goods store, Margaret selected flour, sugar, coffee, and other necessities. The proprietor, Mr. Jenkins, was a kindly older man who asked no questions about her fading bruises but treated her with particular courtesy. "You're staying out at the Double F, I hear," he said as he tallied her purchases. "Yes, I'm keeping house for Mr. Ferguson," Margaret replied, prepared for judgment but finding none in the man's face. "Henry's a good man," Jenkins said approvingly. "Done well for himself, considering how he started with almost nothing. Town could use more like him." Margaret was wrapping up her shopping when the bell over the door jingled and a hush fell over the store. She turned to see Edgar Walton himself standing in the doorway, his small eyes narrowing when they landed on her. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying in the suddenly silent shop. "If it isn't the thieving Boston girl, thought you'd left town for good." Margaret's heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to stand tall. "Mr. Walton," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "I've never stolen anything in my life, as you well know." Walton's face darkened with anger. "Still got a mouth on you, I see. Ferguson hasn't taught you proper respect yet. The only thing Miss Rose needs to learn is how to spot a liar and a bully from a greater distance," came Henry's voice from behind Walton. He stood in the doorway, his tall frame blocking the exit, his expression calm but his eyes hard as flint. "So she can avoid them entirely." Walton spun around, his hand instinctively moving toward the pistol at his hip, but he froze when he saw the cold warning in Henry's gaze. "I wouldn't," Henry said quietly, "not unless you're prepared to finish what you start." For a tense moment, no one in the store moved or spoke, then Walton slowly lowered his hand. "This isn't over, Ferguson," he spat. "You can't be around to protect her all the time." "That sounds remarkably like a threat," Henry replied, his voice still conversational but with an edge that made even Margaret shiver. "I don't take kindly to threats against those under my protection." Walton's face flushed with fury, but he apparently thought better of continuing the confrontation. With a final glare at Margaret, he pushed past Henry and stormed out of the store. The tension in the room broke as everyone seemed to exhale at once. Henry crossed to Margaret, concern evident in his expression. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, and was surprised to find it was true. The fear was there, but it hadn't overwhelmed her. "I'm fine," Henry nodded, then turned to Jenkins. "We'll take the supplies now if they're ready." On the ride back to the ranch, Margaret was quieter than usual, processing the encounter with Walton. Henry respected her silence until they were halfway home. "He won't let it go," Henry finally said. "Men like Walton can't abide being challenged, especially not by a woman." "I know," Margaret replied softly. "I've known men like him before." Henry glanced at her sharply. "In Boston," Margaret nodded but didn't elaborate. She wasn't ready to share that part of her past, not yet. To her relief, Henry didn't press. "Walton has influence in town, but not much beyond it," he said instead. "And he knows better than to come onto my land." "Because he's afraid of you?" Margaret asked, studying Henry's profile. A small smile touched Henry's lips. "Let's just say we have an understanding, Walton and I. One that predates your arrival." That evening, after supper was cleared away and Tomas and Samuel had retired to the bunkhouse, Margaret found herself alone with Henry on the porch of the main house. The night was warm, the sky ablaze with stars, and the sounds of the Texas night surrounded them: crickets, the occasional lowing of cattle, the distant cry of a coyote. "Will you tell me about Boston?" Henry asked, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "What made you leave?" Margaret tensed slightly, then deliberately relaxed her shoulders. After all Henry had done for her, she owed him some truth. "I was engaged," she began, her voice soft in the darkness. "To a man from a prominent family, Charles Harrington. The wedding was set, everything arranged." Henry remained silent, giving her space to continue at her own pace. "I discovered he had violent tendencies. He hid them well until we were alone one evening in his family's garden." Margaret's hand unconsciously rose to her throat, remembering. "He became angry when I expressed an opinion contrary to his. He grabbed me, choked me until I nearly lost consciousness." She heard Henry's sharp intake of breath but continued, finding it strangely freeing to finally speak of it aloud. "When I tried to break the engagement, his family closed ranks. No one believed me. Charles told everyone I was hysterical, inventing stories. In Boston society, his word carried more weight than mine." "So you ran," Henry said, understanding in his voice. Margaret nodded. "I took what money I had saved and headed west. I thought distance would be enough, that I could start over somewhere new." "Then Walton happened," Henry said grimly. "Yes, it felt like history repeating itself." Margaret turned to look at Henry, his face half illuminated by the light from the window. "Until you stepped in." Henry was quiet for a long moment. "Men who hurt women," he finally said, his voice low and controlled, "they deserve neither respect nor mercy." The conviction in his voice stirred something in Margaret, a feeling of safety, yes, but something more. Something that made her heart beat faster and her breath catch in her throat. "Thank you for telling me," Henry said, turning to face her fully. In the dim light, his eyes were dark, intense. "For trusting me with your story." "You trusted me first," Margaret replied, "with your home, your men, your mother's story." Almost without conscious thought, she reached out and laid her hand over his where it rested on the porch railing. Henry went very still, looking down at their hands, then back to her face. "Margaret," he said, her name a question in his mouth. Before either of them could say more, the sound of approaching horses broke the moment. Henry straightened, his hand sliding from beneath hers as he peered into the darkness. "Someone's coming," he said, his voice turning businesslike. "Stay here." He stepped off the porch just as Tomas emerged from the bunkhouse, rifle in hand. The two men stood waiting as three riders approached the ranch house. Margaret watched anxiously from the porch as Henry called out, "That's far enough. State your business." The lead rider pulled his horse to a stop. "Henry Ferguson, I'm Deputy Marshal Williams from Fort Worth." "These are my deputies. We're looking for a man named James Harrington, wanted for fraud and embezzlement in Massachusetts. Trail led us to Baxter Creek, where we heard you might have information." Margaret felt her blood turn to ice. James Harrington, Charles's brother. The man who had helped cover up Charles's violence, who had threatened her when she tried to leave Boston. Henry glanced back at Margaret, saw her face, and made a quick decision. "Dismount and come inside," he told the marshal. "We have things to discuss." The next hour was a blur for Margaret as she sat in Henry's study, recounting her history with the Harrington family to the marshal. She learned that James had fled Boston a week after she had, having been caught embezzling from his family's bank. He was believed to be somewhere in Texas, possibly using an alias. "We have reason to think he's in Baxter Creek or nearby," the marshal explained. "A man fitting his description was seen in town 2 days ago, asking questions about recent arrivals from the east." "He's looking for me," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Charles must have sent him." Henry, who had remained standing behind Margaret's chair throughout the conversation, placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "She's safe here," he told the marshal firmly. "And she'll stay that way." Marshal Williams nodded. "We'll continue our search in town. If this James Harrington is there, we'll find him." He handed Henry a wanted poster with James's likeness. "If you see him, send word immediately. Don't try to apprehend him yourself. He's considered dangerous." After the lawman departed, promising to return the next day with any news, Margaret sat staring into the cold fireplace, feeling as though her carefully constructed new life was crumbling around her. "I should leave," she said dully. "I'm bringing danger to your doorstep." "You're not going anywhere," Henry said, his voice brooking no argument. He knelt before her chair, taking her cold hands in his warm ones. "Margaret, look at me." She raised her eyes to his reluctantly. "This is your home now," he said firmly. "These men, the Harringtons, Walton, they don't get to decide where you belong or whether you're safe. I do, and I say you're staying right here." "But if James finds me, let him try," Henry interrupted, a dangerous edge to his voice. "He'll discover that things work differently out here than they did in Boston." Margaret searched his face, finding nothing but determination and something else, something that made her heart ache with a strange mixture of fear and hope. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you risk yourself for me?" Henry's grip on her hands tightened slightly. "Because you matter, Margaret, to me, more than I expected, more than might be proper given how short a time you've been here." He took a deep breath. "I know it's too soon, you've been through too much. But I need you to know that I will protect you, not out of obligation or pity, but because the thought of harm coming to you is unbearable to me." Margaret felt tears well in her eyes at the raw honesty in his voice. No man had ever spoken to her with such sincerity, such respect. Certainly not Charles Harrington with his practiced charm that had concealed such cruelty. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Not just of James or Walton, I'm afraid of feeling anything for anyone." Henry nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I know, and I'm not asking for anything from you, Margaret. Just let me keep you safe. The rest can wait, however long it takes." That night, as Margaret lay in her cabin, she found herself unable to sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of the dangers closing in around her, Walton's threats, James Harrington's presence nearby, but also with Henry's words, the feel of his hands holding hers, the look in his eyes when he'd said she mattered to him. For 3 months she'd been running, looking over her shoulder, expecting the worst from every man she encountered. And now, against all odds, she'd found safety with a man who looked at her and saw not weakness or an opportunity to dominate, but strength worth protecting and nurturing. Margaret rose from her bed and moved to the window, looking out at the main house where a single lamp still burned in Henry's study. He was keeping watch, she knew, standing guard over her and his ranch. In that moment, something shifted inside her, a decision made without words. Whatever came next, she would face it here, in this place that against all odds had begun to feel like home. The next day dawned hot and clear, a typical Texas summer day. Margaret rose early, determined not to let fear dictate her actions. She prepared breakfast as usual, though Henry looked as though he'd barely slept, having kept vigil most of the night. After the meal, Henry took Margaret aside while Tomas and Samuel began the day's chores. "Marshal Williams will be back today with news," he said. "Until then, I want you to stay close to the house. Don't go anywhere alone." "I can't hide forever, Henry," Margaret said, though she appreciated his concern. "Not forever," he agreed. "Just until they catch James Harrington." The day passed with agonizing slowness. Margaret kept busy in the kitchen, preparing a stew for that evening's meal and baking bread. Around mid-morning, Tomas rode out to check the north pasture, while Samuel worked in the barn repairing tack. Henry remained near the house, ostensibly working on the accounts but actually keeping watch. It was near noon when they heard a rider approaching fast. Henry was on the porch in an instant, rifle in hand, with Samuel emerging from the barn similarly armed. Margaret watched from the window as a lone horseman galloped into the yard. It was Deputy Jenkins, one of the men who had accompanied Marshal Williams the previous night. He dismounted quickly, his expression grave. "Ferguson," he called. "Marshal sent me. Harrington's been spotted. He was asking questions at the saloon about a woman matching Miss Rose's description." When the marshal tried to apprehend him, there was a fight. Harrington escaped, wounded the marshal. Margaret felt her knees weaken and grabbed the edge of the table for support. James had found her trail. "Where is he now?" Henry demanded. "We think he's headed this way," the deputy replied grimly. "Marshal's getting patched up, then bringing reinforcements. Told me to warn you to be ready." Henry nodded. "We'll be ready. How long before the marshal gets here?" 2 hours, maybe 3, depends how bad his wound is." "Go back and tell him we'll watch for Harrington," Henry said. "And deputy, if you see Edgar Walton, keep an eye on him too. He's got reason to wish Miss Rose harm." After the deputy departed, Henry moved with quick efficiency, sending Samuel to alert Tomas and bring him back to the ranch house. Meanwhile, he checked and loaded every firearm in the house. "You know how to shoot?" he asked Margaret. She shook her head. "I've never handled a gun." "Then you'll stay inside, away from the windows," Henry said firmly. "If anyone other than me, Tomas, Samuel, or the marshal comes through that door, use this." He handed her a small derringer. "It's already loaded. Just point and pull the trigger. It won't kill at any distance, but up close it'll stop a man." Margaret took the tiny gun with trembling hands, feeling its surprising weight. "Henry, I'm sorry for bringing this trouble to you." He stopped his preparations and looked at her intently. "Don't apologize for what other men have done," he said. "This is not your fault, none of it." By mid-afternoon, the ranch was as secure as they could make it. Tomas had returned, and he and Samuel were positioned strategically, Samuel in the barn with a clear view of the approach from town, Tomas behind the bunkhouse covering the western approach. Henry remained near the main house, watchful and alert. Margaret tried to keep busy, but anxiety made it difficult to concentrate on any task. She kept the derringer in her apron pocket, its weight a constant reminder of the danger approaching. The sun was beginning to lower in the western sky when they heard multiple horses approaching. Henry signaled to Margaret to stay inside as he moved to the edge of the porch, rifle ready. 4 riders appeared on the road from town. Marshal Williams, his arm in a sling, accompanied by his 2 deputies, and a 4th man Margaret didn't recognize. Henry relaxed slightly at the sight of the lawman but remained vigilant. "Ferguson," the marshal called as they drew near. "No sign of Harrington on the road. You see anything?" "Nothing yet," Henry replied. "But if he's coming, this is where he'll head." The lawman dismounted, and the marshal introduced the 4th man as another deputy who joined them from Fort Worth. They spread out around the property, reinforcing the defenses Henry had established. As twilight descended on the ranch, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Margaret moved through the house lighting lamps, careful to stay away from windows as Henry had instructed. The waiting was almost worse than a direct confrontation would have been. She was in the kitchen when she heard a soft scraping at the back door. Her blood froze in her veins. That door led to a small herb garden she'd planted, enclosed by a low fence. Someone was trying to enter through it. away from the watchful eyes of the men guarding the main approaches. With shaking hands, Margaret withdrew the derringer from her pocket. She moved silently to the side of the door, pressing herself against the wall as the handle slowly turned. The door swung open, and a man slipped inside tall, well-dressed despite trail dust, with features that instantly brought Charles Harrington to mind. His brother James, without question. He carried a revolver in his hand, and had a bloody bandage wrapped around his upper arm, the wound inflicted when he'd escaped the marshal. Margaret remained perfectly still, barely breathing as James took a few steps into the kitchen, his back partly to her as he peered toward the front of the house. This was her chance. "Don't move," she said, her voice remarkably steady as she pointed the derringer at him. "I'll shoot if you do." James Harrington went rigid, then slowly turned to face her, his expression changing from surprise to a cruel smile. "Margaret," he said smoothly, "what a pleasure to see you again. Charles sends his regards." "Put the gun down," Margaret commanded, fighting to keep her hand from trembling. James's smile widened. "That's a lady's derringer, one shot short range. Do you really think you can stop me with that toy?" He took a step toward her. "Charles was quite upset when you ran. He's eager to have you back." "I'm not going back," Margaret said, backing up slightly but keeping the gun trained on him. "The marshal is outside. You won't escape again." "Perhaps not," James conceded, "but I can still complete part of my task." His eyes hardened. "Charles said if I couldn't bring you back, I should make sure no one else could have you either." He raised his revolver, and Margaret pulled the trigger of the derringer without hesitation. The report was deafening in the confines of the kitchen. James staggered back, clutching his shoulder where the small bullet had struck him, but he kept his footing and his grip on his own weapon. "You'll regret that," he snarled, aiming at her heart. The back door crashed open and Henry burst into the kitchen, his own revolver already firing. James Harrington jerked as the bullet struck him in the side. He wheeled, trying to aim at Henry, but a second shot from Henry's gun caught him in the chest. James collapsed to the floor, his unfired revolver clattering on the wooden boards. In an instant, Henry was at Margaret's side, one arm around her waist as he kept his gun trained on Harrington's motionless form. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his eyes quickly scanning her for injuries. "No," Margaret managed, the derringer still clutched in her shaking hand. "I shot him, but it wasn't enough." "You did exactly right," Henry said fiercely. "You kept him talking, gave me time to get here." The marshal and his deputies rushed in, alerted by the gunfire. They found James Harrington dead on the kitchen floor, Margaret still in the protective circle of Henry's arm, and the small derringer finally slipping from her nerveless fingers to the floor. Hours later, after the marshal had taken James Harrington's body away and the ranch had fallen into an exhausted silence, Margaret sat with Henry on the porch of her cabin. The night was cool after the heat of the day, the stars brilliant overhead. "It's over," Henry said quietly. The marshal confirmed it. "James Harrington won't trouble you again." "But Charles might," Margaret said, voicing the fear that had been with her since the confrontation, "when he learns what happened to his brother." Henry took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "The marshal is sending telegrams east. He says with James's death and the evidence they found in his possessions, they have enough to investigate Charles for conspiracy at minimum. Your testimony about his violence would add to that." Margaret looked up in surprise. "You mean I could go back and see him brought to justice?" "If you want to," Henry said, his expression carefully neutral though his hand tightened almost imperceptibly on hers. "The marshal said he'd arrange an escort if you decided to return to Boston." Return to Boston. The possibility hung in the air between them. Margaret turned the idea over in her mind. A month ago, even a week ago, the thought of seeing Charles Harrington face justice would have been all-consuming. Now, "What if I don't want to go back?" she asked softly. Henry's eyes met hers, hope and uncertainty warring in their depths. "Then you stay," he said simply, "for as long as you want. And if I want to stay, indefinitely," Margaret pressed, her heart pounding. A slow smile spread across Henry's face, transforming his features in the moonlight. "Then I'd be the happiest man in Texas," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Because I've been falling in love with you since the day I wrapped my coat around you in town, and every day since has only deepened that feeling." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes, but for once they weren't tears of fear or sorrow. "I never thought I could trust a man again," she whispered. "Never thought I could feel safe or loved." "Do you," Henry asked, leaning closer, "feel safe with me?" "Yes," Margaret answered without hesitation. "Safe, and something else too, something I was afraid to admit, even to myself." Henry raised his free hand to gently cup her cheek. "Tell me," he urged softly. Margaret took a deep breath. "I love you, Henry Ferguson. I think perhaps I have since that first day too, when everyone else turned away and you alone stood up for me." The kiss that followed was gentle, questioning at first, then deepening as Margaret responded with a passion that surprised them both. Henry's arms encircled her, strong yet tender, and Margaret felt the last of her fears melting away in the warmth of his embrace. When they finally parted, Henry rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said, the words more statement than question. "Not today, not tomorrow. When you're ready. But know that I want you by my side, not as my housekeeper, but as my wife." Margaret smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "Yes," she said simply, "when we're ready." 2 months later, on a perfect autumn day, Margaret Rose became Margaret Ferguson in a simple ceremony performed by the circuit preacher in the front yard of the Double F Ranch. Tomas and Samuel stood as witnesses, along with Mrs. Weber from town and several neighboring ranchers who had become friends. Notably absent was Edgar Walton, who had found his influence in Baxter Creek dramatically reduced after Marshal Williams investigated certain irregularities in his business practices that James Harrington had revealed in his final days. As Henry slipped a simple gold band onto Margaret's finger, she thought of how far she had come from that terrible day in town when he had wrapped his coat around her bruised body. From victim to survivor to beloved, it was a journey she could scarcely have imagined. "I, Henry Ferguson, take you, Margaret Rose, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his voice carrying clearly to everyone gathered. "To have and to hold, to protect and cherish from this day forward." The traditional vows had been altered slightly at Henry's insistence. Protection, not possession, was his promise to her. Equality, not subservience, would be the foundation of their marriage. When the ceremony concluded with a kiss that brought cheers from the assembled guests, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just safety, but true partnership and love in the arms of the man who had once been a stranger, stepping forward when all others stood aside. 5 years later, the Double F Ranch had grown considerably, now one of the most prosperous spreads in the county. The main house had been expanded, with a proper schoolroom added where Margaret taught not only Tomas and Samuel, but also the children from neighboring ranches, and most importantly, her and Henry's 3-year-old son, William, and infant daughter, Elizabeth. On the anniversary of their first meeting, Henry and Margaret stood on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant golds and crimsons. Henry's arm was around Margaret's waist, her head resting comfortably on his shoulder. 5 years, Henry mused. "Feels like yesterday and forever all at once." Margaret smiled up at him. 5 years since you wrapped your coat around a frightened, beaten woman. Did you have any idea then what you were starting?" Henry's eyes, still the same storm gray that had first captured her attention, softened as he looked down at her. "I knew you were the bravest woman I'd ever met," he said. "Standing up to Walton when everyone else looked away, I admired that courage." "I didn't feel brave," Margaret admitted. "I felt terrified. That's what real courage is," Henry said, pulling her closer. "Being afraid but doing what's right anyway." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You taught me that." From inside the house came the sound of William's laughter as Tomas, now the ranch foreman, regaled him with another story. Samuel, who had married a young woman from town 2 years prior, could be heard singing softly to baby Elizabeth, his deep voice surprisingly gentle with the lullaby. "We've built something beautiful here," Margaret said, contentment warming her voice. "Something I never thought possible when I fled Boston, and we're just getting started," Henry replied, turning her in his arms to face him fully. "The best is yet to come, Mrs. Ferguson." As the last light of day faded and the first stars appeared in the Texas sky, Margaret Rose Ferguson stood in the embrace of the man who had saved her in more ways than one, surrounded by the family they had created together, secure in the knowledge that some journeys, no matter how difficult their beginning, lead to exactly where you're meant to be.